chapter 12, and it's sort of intriguing as it's going through in David's the armies in the time of David, goes through the different tribes, and it gets to the chiefs of Issachar, and it says, who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. Now, what their understanding of the times was and the extent of that, I guess we don't really know, but there's a logic flow. The only reason they knew what Israel should do, the only reason those leaders knew some direction to take was because they indeed understood the times. And I think there is a need for us as Christians, as leaders, as influencers in our society to understand the times, to know what we, our society, and your church and those around you should do. And knowledge, I think, is key in that regard, knowledge of the times and the culture. I've given you some handouts for some further reading. I tried in these infographics to cram as much information as I could about Australia's demographics, and this one is Australia Street. So we took the census data and we said, all right, well, let's say Australia was shrunk down to be a street of 100 homes, 100 households. What would that look like? Let's say your street, the street you live on, is the average street. Let's say it's got 100 homes, 50 homes up one side of the street, 50 homes on the other side of the street, and it's nationally representative. What goes on your street per year? Well, the answer is a lot of activity. Every year on the average street of 100 homes, again, if it was straight from the census, if it was representative, across those 100 average households, there were 3.5 births. That's a lot of activity on every street of 100 homes in Australia. That means there's a birth every 13 weeks per street of 100 households in Australia. There are 1.7 deaths per year per street of 100 homes. That means there's a death on Australia Street, on your street perhaps, every 7 months. That's a lot of trauma and an issue. And marriages, there's 1.4 marriages per year. There's one marriage every 9 months. A lot of activity takes place on the average street in the average suburb of Australia. And it used to be that at those times, the highs, the lows, the big moments in life, the church was there. The church was that corner of the community that people in our community would connect through. But that's not the case today, as we increasingly see. In fact, even as people stopped attending church, it used to be that at least they would come to church to get married. That was one time at least people would pass through the church doors, and even that has changed. We set record marriages in Australia last year. I don't think that the institution of marriage is not going well. It's going very well. New records numerically in terms of total marriages. But interestingly, 7 in 10 marriages in Australia now are conducted by civil celebrants. Just 30% are conducted in a church by a minister. Big changes happening in our society. And if we look at people's journey of engagement in religion or faith, it's an interesting one. This is a snapshot from our research of a representative sample of Australians and where people are at. And you've got about a quarter of the population who weren't religious and who aren't now religious. So they've been on that non-religious pathway. And you've got just over a quarter who I call continuers, who are committed to the religion in which they were brought up. They were religious, they are religious. That's been their pathway. But the biggest of all is this one, the not now religious category. They were shaped in a religious home, no longer religious. Now, this is all religions, but as we saw this morning, based on the census, with more than 6 in 10 being Christians, it's largely a story of the Christian reality. You might have seen Tom Frame's book, Losing My Religion. That's the title of the book, about Australian spirituality. And that's, as you can see from this data, the pathway of a lot of Aussies were religious and no longer are. You've got just over 10% of Australians who are synthesisers. They follow a set of belief not fitting any one particular religion. Now, when the census comes around, they're forced to choose. Oh, gee, I guess, well, overall, I'm probably more Christian than anything else. So they tick the Christianity box. But I don't think we should get too excited about the 61% who tick Christianity, because it's probably a fair few people that are forced into that because of no other option there. Bit of a do-it-yourself approach, bit of this and a bit of that, the smorgasbord approach. And you've got just under 10% who weren't religious and now are, who switched from one religion to another. So that's the pathway that we have, and I think some great opportunities to connect with our communities, but some challenges there, some pretty clear trend lines as we discussed this morning. But don't get the impression that we're in a society that is antagonistic to Christianity. There is that, for sure. But overall, if we sort of survey the temperature of our community, there's largely warmth towards Christianity. I mean, the fact that 61% identify their religion as Christianity is pretty significant in itself. But if you take that further, and again from research that we have run of some significant samples, you've got here, if almost 2/3 say Christianity is their religion, you've got almost 1/3 that says, I consider myself a Christian. They'll actually not use Christianity as their religion, but use the term Christian to describe themselves. So that's a pretty solid start as far as warmth. Now, what that term means to them, I guess, is a whole lot of different things to different individuals. But nonetheless, on this Engels scale, which is, we've modified this, but it's the Engels scale looks at someone's journey to faith. And as someone crosses the line of faith, they move from -1 to +1. So -1, -2, -3, fairly warm towards Christian things. By the time you're at -5, -6, -7, you're fairly antagonistic towards Christian things. And here we've got -1, -2, -3, about a quarter of the population that are saying, look, I wouldn't call myself a Christian, but I believe in much of Christianity, or I accept much of it, or I believe in the ethics and values of Christianity. So we've got a third who say they are a Christian. You've got another quarter who are very warm towards it. By the time we're at the -4, we're fairly neutral, and then -5, -6, -7, with some issues with Christianity, strong reservations around Christianity, or being passionately opposed to Christianity. You've got about a quarter of the population who are fairly much on the negative side when it comes to Christian things. Now, in the social media world, you hear a lot from this group. In a lot of the mainstream press, you hear a lot from this group. Just in the general debates that take place out there, you'd probably get the impression that this group is more than 1 in 4 of the population. But that it's a fairly vocal group, and a fairly educated, informed, and leveraged group in terms of getting their message out there. But I'd be encouraged with the terrain in which we operate and engage with our community today. So I guess the question is, if we have 61% that tick Christianity as their religion, but not even or only around 1 in 10 of those regularly attending church, what's the go with the other 9 in 10 that call their religion Christianity but don't attend church? This is a key challenge that we have in Australia. Very few other organisations would accept such a thing. And I just think if you're at the McDonald's conference and they say, well, we've got good news, 6 in 10 Australians call themselves Macca fans. Only about 1 in 10 of them, though, ever goes to McDonald's. There'd be a problem with that, and they'd be wanting to convert or to translate into sales the other 9 in 10 of those Macca's fans. I was watching the Gruen transfer a couple of years ago, where some of this research that we ran for the Jesus All About Life campaign made its way onto that TV program. And Todd Sampson, if you've seen him, very articulate in these issues of marketing and communications. And he said, this is interesting research, that we have a population that are fine with Christianity and that even accept and are warm towards Jesus, but aren't red hot on the church. He said, putting it in commercial language, what we have is a population that likes the product, they just don't like the retail outlet. And it's an interesting way of expressing it from someone a fair way from Christian things. And it's not that they have rejected the church, actually. It's that they have rejected a perception of the church. Because the majority of them who have strong opinions on the church haven't been to church in a long time or at all. Haven't seen the sort of gathering that we're about here, nonetheless have some strong opinions. We've surveyed Australians and asked them, well, why don't you go to church? Let's try to find out why we have this big gap between the 7% who regularly attend church and the 61% of our nation who call themselves Christians. And for every person who says, well, it's because I don't believe what you guys teach. You've got 7 times as many who say, as their primary reason, well, because it's just not relevant to me. How you communicate, what goes on in church is not relevant to me. Now again, they're rejecting a perception of church. Their thought, what has been communicated to them through other channels about church, they probably haven't had a recent experience of church. Nonetheless, that perception is reality, and we need to respond to that. It's growing with the younger generations, and so breaking through these perception issues is the challenge for us today. I thought I'd give you a bit of a quiz, and we might have a bit of discussion on this and get some of your thoughts at this point. I put this up When most of us were at school, this is how the ABCs looked. A for apple and B for bumblebee and C for car and that sort of thing. But we are now engaging with a 21st century generation, Generation Z as they have been labelled, children and teenagers today, those born since 1995. And they've been shaped in this digital era. And so their ABCs look a little bit more like this. I've just taken some of the social media brands for a moment. Now, I want to test your digital literacy, see how connected with Gen Z you are right now. So let's try the first few, just by looking at letters, see if you can identify these 21st century brands. So first up, we've got A for Amazon. Oh, that's very good. B for Blogger. Okay, excellent. C for very good. And D for Dig is the brand there, so a bit of a sharing site. What about E for very good, and F for and G for Google. All right, so we made sure we got those last ones, which is good. Maybe if we had a few Gen Zs we could have got them all, but pretty good going. Now, they have only ever known this world of digital media and wireless connectivity and social interaction on these emerging platforms and apps and tablets and touch screens. I was watching my son Corbin recently, he's 3, and we were at a gathering and he wandered up, as kids do, they tend to crowd around screens. He was bored with what was on the TV screen. I had a look at him elbow his way through the other kids and he just started flicking the screen like this, just trying to change channels, just as he's used to on the iPad. And it's an interesting world where every piece of glass comes to life, where the technology is touch and kinesthetic in terms of what drives. I'll be worried the day I see him standing in front of the glass sliding door trying to bring it to life. The sliding door's broken, what's wrong with it? I can't see any colour, but nonetheless that's the world that has shaped them. Now, let me pause at this point and get you to share, maybe for a moment with those around you, what are the big shifts you have seen in the culture from an attitude to church perspective, even perhaps from a technology and generational perspective. What were the attitudes like, amongst your earliest memories compared to the attitudes that you see today? What are the shifts? What are the social changes that you've seen? I might get you to reflect a little bit on that with those around you, and then we'll share some of that together, and we'll look at a few responses to some of these trends. All right, let's bring you back and let's share some of your thoughts on the changes and the shifts, and then we'll look at, well, how do we respond? How do we engage in these times? So maybe you've got some anecdotes or thoughts. Yes?
Yeah, what we've come up with, there's no absolutes. Whereas people were teaching their kids years ago, right from wrong.
Yes.
It's now, you can decide for yourself, And I know when I became a Christian, even in church, there were absolutes.
Yes.
This is God, this is the world.
Yes. That's true. Yeah. And as people of truth, we work in the world of reality and absolutes and structure. And you're right, in this postmodern time, as it's been called, everything is whooshy, and that's true for you, but this is true for me. Yes?
Yeah, we were discussing about what church is, in definition of church being changed. Now that we can download a whole service, not just the sermon, but also the whole service, people think maybe, I don't need to go to church, I can just download it and watch it on my TV or even on my phone.
Yes. Yeah, and big difference, redefinition of, as you say, church and who's in and who's out. And it used to be clear, there was almost a definition of who's in, who's in. Now, and hopefully, communities and churches are defined by what we're about, by the core, not the circumference. And we're bringing people on a journey, we're connecting with others as we journey them towards faith.
This is an observation, I don't know how true it is, but whereas back in my parents' generation, in baby boomers, it was cultural to go to church. We've seen the decline in numbers in attendance, but that's pretty much what it was, cultural. There wasn't, so people can still be sitting in church and not actually be genuine Christians, whereas even though the attendance has gone down, maybe the genuineness has increased because people who go actually want to be there.
Yes, yeah, great
point. Not saying that's every single person who sits in a church is a Christian, doesn't mean if you sit in a garage you're a car.
Yes.
Yeah, it's the genuineness has increased. So even though the numbers are bad,
yes,
it could actually be a bonus in that fact.
That's a great point. You know, when we had, as I said earlier, in the 60s, where 1 in 4 adults attended church, now it's about 1 in 14. Back then it was more a cultural thing, it was cultural Christianity. Now you've got to, as you said, almost swim against the tide to turn up at church. You're definitely anti the convention, you're anti the mainstream if you're spending your Sundays in a church. So you're right about people are really opting in, and it's more a sign of personal identity in terms of church attendance than just the cultural pressure today. Did I see another hand? Someone else had a thought or a comment? Yes.
You mentioned about marriages, and also funerals.
Yes. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
That disconnection or the need for the church and being part of the church to carry out that function.
Yeah, exactly. They've become real, events, and they're not just through the church. Funerals follow the pathways of marriages in that regard. Did I see another hand? Yes.
I've noticed that nowadays people, the younger generations, are more comfortable with their gadgets than actually talking face to face.
Yes.
So for me, I think it's causing a massive drop in social skills.
Yes.
There's no social skills anymore.
Yeah.
Because they are more comfortable talking to their friends through Facebook and Twitter and all this stuff than to actually confronting face to face.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And technology does help us connect, and it adds a lot to our life. But in a lot of ways, as you've said, it reduces comfort zones, it reduces social skills. It's what we call a social risk reducer. So you can hide behind the technology and reduce those social risks, which means that you don't develop the skills. And on the negative side, people will say things or do things that they would not do face to face. And that's been the rise of a lot of the cyberbullying that has affected young people particularly. So some challenges there that come in the changing times, as well as some benefits. Hopefully there's some more information there you can grasp. And it's not one size fits all. I mean, there's a lot of variation across the states and across the generations here in Australia. Have a look even at this population growth rate of the states. WA and Queensland growing twice as fast as some of the southern states. In fact, I found this interesting. Tasmania is at the bottom of the list there. It's the slowest growing state. It's got a net loss in terms of more people are leaving the state than are joining it. But we always are innovative in Australia at finding solutions. And if you have a look across to the other side, you've got this bar or line graph that's got the total fertility rate. And have a look at which state is the number one. And it's none other than Tasmania. So if no one's going to move there, they've got a bit of a breeding program, and they're increasing numbers by natural increase. So good on them, and some great numbers and births taking place there. The other thing you'll notice, and I've put some things like life expectancy and just the increases in that. We're living 10 years longer today than we were 40 years ago, a generation ago. And so it's a demographic reality to say that 50 really is the new 40 compared to what was the case a generation ago. 40 is the new 30, 30 is the new 20. I haven't heard anyone say 20 is the new 10 at some point. I think the metaphor breaks down. But you get the point that people are younger, longer, living longer, and redefining those life stages. So we surveyed Australians and said, well, let's say there was a spare block on the corner in your community. Let's say there was some development that could take place there in your neighbourhood. What would you want to be built there? What would you want that would serve the needs of you and your family, firstly, and then serve the needs of your community? And we put down these 12 different options. And so what people want, if they were given a choice in the local suburb and there was a spare block of land, turn it into a park or a community centre or a cafe or some more parking or some retail. These were the priorities. All the way down to dog parks, outdoor sports areas, childcare. Got a higher ranking for the community than for some individuals because they don't have kids, so they're saying low. These are the two rankings here. But out of the 12 options in both areas, the church was at the very end of the list. And that's a challenge for us. But we have a community, a society is not sitting on the edge of their sofas thinking, well, I hope a church sets up next door. That'll be the answer to my needs, because they're not seeing their life that way. However, if you look at what these things are and look at what the church is about, in terms of a place of connection and community and fellowship and interaction and doing life together, of course, church is offering that. I'm not sure how much retail takes place or other things, but church is able to meet some of those deeper yearnings of Australians. It's just that they're not viewing the church through that lens. I found this one particularly confronting, that the church is ranked behind these dog parks, these leash-free dog areas. They put one in our suburb recently, and I've been down there. My family, we don't have a dog. We got all these kids, so we should, but busy enough with the kids. And so we've recently discovered, though, the benefits of these dog parks. We take our kids down, they play with other people's dogs for half an hour, we wash their hands, dust their clothes off, take them back home. It's fantastic. So I can recommend the dog parks. I'm a fan myself as a non-dog owner. But I do see at the dog park at Cherrybrook, where I go, fellowship. I see people interaction. I see a society that's looking for that interaction and desperately seeking it, and in a lot of ways not finding it. We asked Australians, churchgoers and non-churchgoers, what out of these 7 areas of life, what's your priority? Rank them for us. Let's think about non-churchgoers. The relational area is key in life, and the emotional health matters, and the physical, I've got to get fit, and financial's important, vocational, social, and spiritual. 7th on the list of issues in life. It's a low priority for Australians. Obviously, churchgoers, it's way up there. We then asked a follow-up question. If that's the priority, where is the satisfaction level across these same 7 areas? Let's have a look at non-churchgoers for a moment. Relational was the one priority, and they're saying, yep, that's good. And second most fulfilled area in their life is the spiritual. Remember, it's the lowest priority, and even if you look at that area, they're full up, or they feel that they are. It's just a thimble to take. That's all it takes to fill it. Just a few drops of some spiritual thoughts, but that's where they are at. They've read a motivational quote or read a little article that was inspiring of late, and so their spiritual tank is full. And if they see the church simply as a religious dispensary or meeting, what they perceive as spiritual answers without meeting the broader areas of life, of course, then there are some challenges. And I think we need to make our society thirsty for this one and see the priority that indeed that is, and how Christianity is, of course, and Christ meets and gives meaning across all of those areas. I like Jesus' interaction with his disciples in Matthew chapter 13. I was excited, particularly as a social researcher that spends a lot of my time running focus groups, to see that Jesus himself ran focus groups, and we see that in Matthew chapter 13. I'm in the right area, and we read here. Let me just get the passage here. Matthew chapter 16, verse 13, and it says this: When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" We tend to have about 8 people in our focus groups. Jesus had 12 in his, but he asked this great open-ended question: "And who do people say that I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And then he asked the key question: "But what about you?" He asked, "Who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." It's encouraging there that we don't need to worry about the future of the church. Jesus said he will build it, and the gates of Hades won't prevail against it. The church is in good hands with him building it, but we have to be effective in the responsibility of engaging with our communities in that regard. And I think Jesus' method of asking people, "Hey, who do people say that I am?" and then importantly asking them, "Well, what about you? Who do you say that I am?" That is the key question for our society. We asked Australians this question, and how much knowledge they had of Jesus' words. And we put down in this survey, these are some phrases, some Jesus said, some he didn't say. And we asked more than 1,000 people, all right, well, which do you think Jesus said and which they didn't? And you see here that the majority of Australians correctly identified these 3 statements as being from Jesus. "I've come that you may have life and have it to the full." Or, Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This is my commandment, that you love one another. So more than half of our population correctly attributed those sayings to Jesus. 1 in 5 thought Jesus said this: God helps those who help themselves. Jesus said the exact opposite. The gospel is the exact opposite, that we can't help ourselves and we need a saviour. Therefore, but for the grace of God go I. Anything that had God in it or sounded spiritual, people thought, yeah, Jesus must have said that. But he didn't. While you live, tell truth and shame the devil. That was Shakespeare, not Jesus. And I'm particularly worried about our Australian history. 6% thought Jesus' last words were such is life. Far too much Monty Python, I think, has influenced our culture. Jesus, of course, said, it's finished, it's done, you don't have to strive anymore. And what a great message that we have to take to a striving, desperate, stressed, pressured society of peace and rest, and it's finished. And yet our society, while hungry for that teaching, haven't come across that teaching. How are they going to? Well, we sometimes think, well, Aussies don't like people talking about politics or religion. Well, actually, it's not the case. 7% often talk about or have religious or spiritual conversations with their friends when they gather. And another 46% occasionally do. In fact, if you total that, more than half of the entire population have conversations with friends about spiritual or religious things. But to make it happen, from occasionally to more frequently, or for those who don't, it does require some facilitation. It does require us to step in and ask an open-ended or connect with their life and hopefully build some connection point to be able to be there when the questions arise. Let me pause and get you then to, I guess, share from your toolbox some of the strategies that have worked for you when it comes to communicating in your community with friends. How do you engage with those around you? What have been some ways of starting an effective conversation in this era, in the western suburbs of Sydney? Because it's different to how it was 20 years ago. And as you saw, that knowledge of Christian things is starting to drip away. So how do you do it? What's been useful, or what are some ways that you found it useful to engage in those Christian conversations? I'll give you a couple of minutes to discuss that, and then again we'll share together, and then we'll look at a few tips that might assist in that regard. All right, let me bring you back once more to share some thoughts. And we'll get some comments from you all in terms of what's worked for you. In fact, I've got a quiz for you that I'll put up in a moment. But just before we do that, any thoughts? What has worked for you? What have been some ways that you've found effective in terms of talking to your friends and community members about Christ and Christian things? Any comments or observations?
I reckon just if you let people know that you go to church and you say that enough, conversations come out of it. So you've got to be gutsy to say.
Yeah. And as we said earlier, it's a more unusual thing to be going to church and being committed to it. Questions will flow from that. We surveyed Australians, asking them what language do they give to Christians that take it seriously, and particularly we put before them lots of these terms that get pinned to Christians today to see their responses, and the term fundamentalist Christian did not go down very well. People were more negative than positive about that. Even the term born again Christian, our society is a bit more negative than that. It's got some negative stereotypes. We thought the term evangelical is a term we use amongst ourselves. That also was more negative than positive in the mix. We've got an infographic on our website that discusses this. But terms that were more positive than negative were phrases like practicing Christian, or ordinary Christian, or normal Christian. So describe yourself as a normal Christian, and people will like that. Maybe evangelical sounds a bit too heavy for all concerned. Other thoughts you've had that have helped you have some conversations with those around you? Ray?
I mean, it's an oldie, but have you come to a point in your spiritual life where you know for certain you're going to heaven?
Wow. Yeah. Puts it there. People look for that certainty. While 6 in 10 call themselves or identify with Christianity, 9 in 10 Australians believe that there is more to life than this existence. So that question is really going to bring it to a head. So how do you get to heaven? What is it about?
Particularly with young kids, so teenagers, you hardly ever do face-to-face stuff with them because they don't really feel comfortable. So using your social media is great. But you know, you can post a verse up there and they can read it. But to get them talking, people have already done so. You've already got the research on there. People have already written blogs on it, and so you just repost that.
Yes.
And often they'll read something or read a sentence, and then that'll get people talking.
Yeah. That's great, isn't it? It's a journey to faith, and we said that technology can be a social risk reducer, and people do move through a phase of exploring but wanting to keep their anonymity or wanting to keep it relaxed, and so connecting through that way can be less intimidating for both sides of the conversation. Certainly the Australian language is changing, and I thought I'd give you a quick quiz on this to see if you can recall some Aussie slang, particularly rhyming slang, strine as it used to be called. So firstly, a Joe Blake. Do you know what a Joe Blake is? Oh, that's pretty good. Only 44% of Australians knew that, so you're up there. That's very good. What about trouble and strife? All right, I'm sure we don't use it, but nonetheless, about a third of Australians knew that as well. What about, this was from a national survey round, what about this third one here, frog and toad? Going to hit the road, very good. Just a quarter of Australians knew that one. What about get me on the dog and bone? Very good. 20% of Australians have used or recognised that phrase. What about do the Harold Holt? Do the bolt. Very good. So you're up with the Aussie strine. Do the bolt. Do the Harold Holt. Do the run for it. Yeah. So there we go. You've just a little bit of a reminder of the good Aussie slang. While we're thinking words here, words, phrases. This was from a survey where we asked Australians, what are your perceptions of the church? And in open-ended questions, they wrote down words. And I've used a word cloud meter to put down the words that people say about the church, Australians, and these are the issues that they have with the church. You can see some of the words coming out there. We ran some research called the Australian Communities Report, and we looked at the belief blockers of Australians, commissioned by Carl Fage. You might have come across him from Gymea Baptist and Olive Tree Media, and he's turned these top 10 belief blockers into a video series called Towards Belief. So we had to find, well, what are the big hang-ups that Australians have to the church? What are those belief blockers that when they think about the church, they go, oh, the church is in that, and forget about it, and they don't want to investigate further. And here are the top 5 belief blockers related to the church of those who are open to changing their religious view. They're not closed to Christian things, but they're not churchgoers. And these were the hang-ups they had, the belief blockers around the church, the exclusivity of the church, issues around money. And a lot of that's come in from other places like America, but nonetheless, the church has a little bit of that stigma here in Australia as well. Authoritarian and the hypocrisy or judging of the church. I'm going to get judged and Bible bashed if I go in there. It's outdated. These are the perceptions that they had. And very strong feeling that the church is hierarchical, authoritarian, and going to point the finger at me. And as we know, broader society has moved away from these hierarchical structures, the command and control model. And in Australia, we've always been a little bit sort of pushing back on that very strong authority, authoritarian model to these flatter structures of collaboration, cooperation and connection. That's what we're about in terms of engaging with our community, but there's still a perception that the church is authoritarian in that traditional sense. I found a slogan, a sign that obviously was posted on workplaces in the past, seriously or not, but certainly wouldn't work today. Warning, firings will continue until morale improves. Not sure that it ever worked, but certainly won't these days in this era where people expect a bit more of a flat structure, a journey to understanding and connecting where they are at. And so I put down here, well, how do we engage? Traditionally, when it comes to communicating the gospel, we've, I guess, sometimes focused too much on the cognitive, on the content, on almost like a bullet point presentation. And if we communicate that, we're going to end up with agreeers. Now we're going to be able to debate the questions that they have, deliver a strong apologetic. We're going to win the argument. We're going to get people that say, yeah, I get it here, but I don't get it here. And you know, the 21st century really has opened up this vertical axis, not just the cognitive engagement or the rational engagement, but the emotional, relational engagement. The online world is really this axis, not this. It's about social media, it's about connecting with others, it's about videos, it's about images, it's about connecting at a heart level, not just a head level. And much of the communication, the power of brands these days is all focused on connecting here, not here. And of course, the gospel, when we communicate, it has to connect with the heart and not just the head. Now, if all we do is share a testimony, share something engaging, build the relational connection, but don't clearly communicate the gospel, we'll end up with seekers who say, I'm excited about it, I think there's something there for me, I'm not really understanding what you're saying about the gospel. And so we've got to connect with the head and the heart. Both axes are important in effective communication today. And once we've communicated content and done it in a relational and heart-focused way, I think head and heart on board, we've got the embraces. These are the people who respond to the truth, who hear it, as I said this morning, with the eyes of their head and the eyes of their heart. And sometimes you disconnect, both head and heart, and in addition to agreeers and seekers and embracers, we've got the hecklers who push back, who question. Now, when you get the hecklers out there, it's not just that they disagree with what you're saying rationally. The reason for the heckling is that they disagree with it emotionally. That's what energizes the heckling. And often a -7 heckler can be turned around to a +7 heckler, but that can't happen just on the cognitive axis. It's a relational, emotive one as well. When you look at, the very first sermon of the church preached, we have recorded in Acts chapter 2, Peter's sermon at Pentecost. It's amazing that you see the two axes here clearly presented. He starts off and he says, listen carefully, connect. I'm going to get some content out here. And he starts quoting Joel and he starts quoting David and these things that you have known. He's quoting from their prophets. But then as he moves through, it's not just a head connection. It's not just an analysis of their history and connecting with what they know from Scripture cognitively, because he then talks about what's happened and who this Jesus is. And he starts to wind up the message in verse 36 of Acts chapter 2. Therefore, let all Israel be assured of this. God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ. When the people heard this, they were cut to the heart. And they said to Peter and the other apostles, brothers, what shall we do? Peter replied, repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of your sins. And at the end of that passage, those who accepted the message were baptized, and about 3,000 were added to their number that day. It was a clear message, a great sermon that connected and had the content, the truth presented rationally, but also it cut them to the heart, and they responded in truth to the leading of the Spirit. I think our communication ought to be that way as well. I thought I'd finish with 4 final words to keep in mind when we communicate with our friends and family in these changing times. And they're 4 R words, 4 R's if you like. Remember back to the education system, there used to be 3 R's and 2 of them weren't even R's. Did that bug you like it bugged me? Well, these are 4 genuine and authentic R's. Didn't have to force it at all. And the first of the R's is keep it real. I think we are in an era where people are looking for authenticity. They're looking for integrity. They want people who actually know where they're going and have some security around that. We're in a time where people are searching. I mean, people always have been, but the trends and the fads seem to come faster and faster today in a time of a great search. And we have some reality, and we live that security, and I think that's what our world looks for. I was passing through Adelaide Airport maybe about a month or 2 ago, and every time I'm there I see this sign which sort of lacks some reality to me. Adelaide Airport uses recycled water for toilet flushing, so do not drink. I've never been tempted to, but just trying to work out what they're about. I think it got lost in translation somewhere. We've got to hopefully have a message of reality, not just something that's as convoluted as that. The second R is to keep it relevant. I think we do have to, as we saw in Colossians 4, communicate the message clearly as we should, and that requires us to communicate in relevant ways, seasoned with salt so we know where the thirst is, so that we can create some of that thirst for the things of Christ. There are some messages or metaphors or strategies that might have been relevant in the past that probably are not as relevant today. I think the apologetic of today is not so much an evidence that demands a verdict. Josh McDowell, prove the historicity of the Bible. I think we need that. We've got an educated society and more going to university. But in other ways, there's a heart apologetic that people want. They want to hear your story and what God's done for you and how that's worked out for you and why you believe this to be the truth. It's, in a sense, a shift from the head apologetic to the heart apologetic, as I've been saying. So we've got to be relevant to the changes that we see. I found a sign online that might have been relevant in the past but no longer is. If you see someone drowning, now that's a picture, it's supposed to be a picture of someone drowning. Help, I'm drowning. A stick figure. But we don't see it like that these days. If you see someone drowning, lol. Now, to laugh out loud is not the right response when someone is struggling out there in the water. It's no longer relevant. So we need to update this sign, and we need to update sometimes how we communicate as well. The third R, keep it real, keep it relevant, keep it responsive. We have to respond to the needs of our community. We have to meet some of those felt needs as we address, of course, the real needs. We have to serve our community, and that happens best when we understand our community. And so, do the local research, knock on the doors, understand, look up the demographic social trends reports for the area, find out what those in your community are needing, what the key needs are, and be responsive to those needs. As Australians, we've always been responsive. It's a bit of an entrepreneurial nation, can-do nation. We sort things out. I found an entrepreneur has recently come up with a solution to a problem that has emerged in some workplaces, where some people go to the fridge, the common fridge, and try to take other people's lunches. And he has invented an anti-theft lunch bag. He takes these Ziploc bags and he prints black paint on the outside of these Ziploc bags so you can put your sandwich in. And so you can see that is not safe. That is safe. No one's going to come anywhere near it. It's a pretty impressive, innovative solution, a responsive invention to a new challenge. So keep it real, keep it relevant, keep it responsive, and finally keep it relational. That's always been the core to our relation, to our community, to our conversations, is that relational heart. That old saying, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. It's so true. And social media has really highlighted, I think, the relational base of our world, of our technology. I think this sign took it a little bit too far. Be the first of your friends to like this post. Probably got a bit too literal there. But you get the point that people are in a relational world. They want those relational connections. It's not all found online. In fact, it's found more in genuine face-to-face community as you live that authentic Christ-focused life. And that will be the answer to a community looking for something more, and hopefully they will respond to the truth. I'll again save the PowerPoint here if people want it, and there's more resources freely accessible on the website. But may God bless you as you connect with your community.
Thank you.
Mark's generously offered his time for one or two questions from the floor before we have to wrap it up. So if there's any questions.
Hey Mark, generally people are massively consumeristic, and the expectation of what they receive from the retail sector is big, and if they don't like it, they just change. I saw a big sign saying, "Don't like your energy provider, switch."
Yes.
Like, it's as easy as changing channel. People approach church like that as well. Is there? I mean, are those 4 R's the response to that, or does the church have need to be upping their ante as well, upping the game and offering a better product in a sense?
Well, I think it's a great point that we are in a consumeristic society. We call it expectation inflation, that people's expectations continue to grow. You jump on a flight, $79 flight to Melbourne, and it's got a screen in front of you, and the next flight you're on doesn't have a screen. You think, what's going on? Once we have once we have a fulfillment of something, we expect that to become the standard. As they say, yesterday's options are now today's standards. So we continue to grow and grow in what we want. And I think as the church, we have to actually, rather than meet that and jump into that, sidestep that and say, well, actually, we're not about customers are not communities. Consumers are not communities. The church is a community. Consumers don't have a mutual obligation. They go in, they spend the money, they get the stuff, they go. But we're not about that in the church. We're not about pay your money and you get your stuff. We're about a community of contribution, a community of connection, which involves sacrifice and commitment and involvement. It involves everyone on board, and I think that's actually an inspiring vision of community. That's what people want. They don't just want to sit back and have service done. They want to participate in that service. And I think if we can change the conversation and show how important that contribution is to being part of the community, that'll inspire. Now, contribution is not required to be part of the community, but the sense of community is fulfilled through the contribution, and that's what we try to communicate. Just because you can't or won't contribute at the moment, that's okay. Journey with us, but you know what? Your fulfillment in the community will grow through that contribution, involvement, and service, and obviously that's what the Lord requires of us. So I think shifting that conversation is key to get out of that consumer language. I did see one other hand.
Yeah, I was just curious that when you talked about life priorities being different, and you said that the non-church group felt spiritually fulfilled. What about the church group? Are we being real? Are we feeling that spiritual fulfillment in the church? Because when you talk about being real, are we real?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and probably we could take that data and do some more filtering to see how fulfilled people in the church feel in that spiritual area. It was brought up earlier by someone saying that people's experience of what church is now, or indeed how they meet those spiritual needs, has become a bit broader. People will download a sermon online, or they'll connect up in some other way. So people have some other options there. But I think it is important that people connect with an actual church community rather than just a virtual one, because that is the fulfillment of, again, Christ's church that he is building, and it allows the full dimensions of that community. And I think the full dimensions of spiritual engagement as well, but could be something for further analysis.
Just to continue on that question, do you think, and we touched on it a little bit earlier, do you think we are being happier in churches?
Are we happier in our... Yeah, I mean, I think the consumer concept does emerge, and we think, oh, well, I've got a lot of options here and I'm not happy here, and we can end up, whinging and griping a little bit. I was running focus groups. We were asking, they were Gen Y, so they were all in their early 20s, what they thought of this. It was superannuation, and I mean, keep in mind, it's all being provided for them. The employers, chipping it in, and it's going to be a lot of money and it's their money and it's their retirement, but they just were not engaged with it, and just the attitude was really interesting to me. In fact, it was well summed up by, I think it was 18 or 19, Stuart in the focus group. I still remember his response about an hour into the discussions about super and your future and whatever. He said, look, mate, he said, it's not that we don't care on purpose. He said, it's just that we don't care. And pretty fair. Where do you go with that, But I think that can be an attitude. People aren't trying to be difficult. They just don't care. They've got a lot going on in their life. That's probably people outside the church. And if that attitude creeps into the church, I think then we have to change the equation again, get people to realise this is your church. You're part of the body here. You're a body part. You're required. It's not service to you. It's you being part of this whole body. Right.
Mark, those 4 R's. While you don't want to play to the worldly categories, they are real. They're valued within Scripture. Real, relationship. What are the other ones?
Relevant, responsive.
Relevant, which is a sort of applied word. Responsive. What do you mean by responsive?
That we're prepared to adapt. So it's Paul at Mars Hill, at the Areopagus there, connecting with Athens. I see that you're religious. Whereas when he was in a more secular place,
culturally flexible.
Exactly.
So what have you seen in churches that kind of highlight any of those? As you've probably gone around a fair bit speaking. So what have you watched that we could maybe learn from, or you really appreciate was helpful?
Yeah, I have seen some different churches in operation. I think those that are trying to sort of position themselves to be more the hub in their community, to meet some of those needs in the community, are doing well. I mean, as we saw, people aren't so much thinking about a church, but they are needing some childcare, and they are looking for a community centre, and they are looking for a place to connect where they can have a coffee and do life. And that was just one. There's a lot more research there. We also looked at services. What services do you want? Do you want spiritual services or church services? No. Again, unfortunately, that was 12 out of 12. But they are looking for some parenting seminars. They're looking for some seminars on relationships and handling that. There was financial literacy seminars that they wanted, and handling conflict and handling stress and job skills. So the services and the facilities that we look for in the community, the church is about. And there are some great churches that are realising and responding, and this being one of them, that it's not the steeple on the hill and people coming on a Sunday morning when the bell rings anymore, but it's about actually meeting some of those more felt needs of a post-Christian culture, and through that seeing the Christian and responding in truth that way. And I've seen a few models of that have worked very well.